Chapter 2 of the Automobile Girls at Newport by Laura Dent Crane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lost, Strayed, or Stolen. "Molly Thurston, has Barbara driven off with those awful horses?" It was Grace Carter who spoke. She had reached the doorway of the cottage just in time to catch a glimpse of the departing equipage. Without waiting for a reply, she turned from the open door to the group inside just as Molly rejoined, then exclaiming, "Barbara is driving the runaways to the hotel for the machine." Mrs. Thurston started. She had been downstairs for some time helping to make the victims of the accident comfortable. She was a slim, sweet faced little woman, whose entire world lay in her two lively young daughters, in whom she had unlimited faith. But in a moment she smiled and said, "I am not afraid to trust Barbara with anything." Ruth Stewart's lately pale face was glowing. "I think that is regularly splendid of her," she exclaimed, with more animation than she had shown since she had left the carriage. "Oh, Barbara is used to taking care of herself," Gladys LeBaron interposed, with a supercilious smile. Molly looked at her cousin a moment. "Yes," she answered steadily. "We think it is a pretty good thing in our family." Gladys flushed and had no reply ready. Ruth looked surprised, and Grace plunged into the breach. "Oh," she tried to murmur offhandedly. "Barbara and Molly and Gladys are cousins, you know." "And you never." Ruth turned to Gladys, then stopped and smiled. "Well, it's awfully jolly to have met you all in this nice informal way. Grace has often spoken of you," she said. The girls had to laugh at this, so Ruth continued. "I'm well enough now to be proper and conventional, I suppose. I believe you know I'm Ruth Stewart. Mrs. Thurston, Molly, have you met Gladys's friend, Mr. Townsend?" The young man came out from the corner near the window, where he had been seated, and bowed gaily. Ruth nodded in a satisfied fashion. "There, doesn't that finish it?" she sighed. "The rest of you are all acquainted, aren't you? Now, won't one of you please tell me why those awful horses aren't running still? I know some horrible white hay caps started them, and Jones fell off the seat, and now we are here. Who stopped us?" Everybody turned to Ruth at once. "Why, Barbara stopped them," Grace managed to say first. "Barbara!" A gay laugh sounded in the doorway, and Barbara herself appeared before them. "Now I've caught you," she cried merrily, her bright eyes sweeping the circle. Then she turned to Ruth with a mock courtesy. "Your ladyship's chariot awaits," she declaimed. Then continuing, in quick explanation, "You see, your driver was scarcely hurt, and he rushed back to the hotel at once and sent the automobile along the road where he had seen the horses disappearing. Before I'd gone a quarter of a mile, I met the machine with the chauffeur and the doctor and Jones himself. We sent Jones back with the horses, though they weren't bothering me a bit, and I came back in the automobile. How are you feeling?" And the bright voice softened sympathetically as she noted Ruth's pale cheeks. For answer the girls arose quickly and held out both hands to Barbara. "You're a brick," she said simply. "I fainted like a goose, and they've just told me what you did. I am so glad I know you, and I guess my father will be glad too, not to say thankful. Now, please, won't you and your sister dine with us to morrow? No? Make it lunch, then I'll see you sooner. I won't take no for an answer, because I have a very important plan. Dad decides as quickly as I do. So if you'll only say yes, but I can't tell you about it now. Perhaps if I make you curious, you'll be more interested when the time comes." Ruth laughed mischievously. "What have you up your sleeve now, Ruth Stewart?" asked Grace curiously. "I never saw such a girl as you are for chain lightning projects." "You'll see," laughed Ruth. "You're in it, too, you know. You must be one of my lunch party to morrow. I know you and Mr. Townsend have another engagement. Gladys, so you will pardon my delivering my invitation before you. Now I won't say another word. Come," she continued, addressing the party. "We must be off at once. If the news of this runaway circulates through the hotel and reaches either your father or mine, Gladys, they'll be wild with fright. Good bye, Mrs. Thurston, and thank you. You've been awfully good to us. As for you two," holding out her hands to Barbara and Molly, "wait till tomorrow at lunch." Drawing the two Thurston girls with her, she stepped outside the door and to the gate, the rest of the party following. The machine was waiting in the road, and out of it hurried the hotel doctor toward Ruth. "Are you hurt, Miss Stuart?" he cried. "I wouldn't have come in, but Miss Thurston said she would go in first and see how you were." "I'm perfectly well, doctor," smiled Ruth. "It's too bad you had to come way out here. I hope father will not hear you have been sent for." She patted affectionately the nearest tire rim of the big automobile. "Bless the Bubble's heart," she murmured. "He wouldn't run away with his missus, Barbara. Molly, this is my best friend, Mr. A. Bubble. I think you'll get better acquainted with him before long. I wish you could come with me now, but I'm afraid neither you nor Bubble would be quite comfortable, and you three must get along well together from the start." The doctor helped Ruth into the big red touring car, and Gladys and Grace followed. The two men and the chauffeur crowded together in the front seat. "Au revoir," chorused the autoists, and "see you to morrow," nodded Ruth emphatically to the girls. Then, in a whirl of dust, the big machine sped out of sight. "Isn't she a dear?" burst forth Molly, as the sisters turned to go back to the house. "How her eyes shine when she talks! I wonder if I could do my hair that way. I was sure she'd be nice. But what do you suppose she means by that? Barbara, for heaven's sake, how did you happen to think of that umbrella stunt? It was great, but you did look so funny, like a sort of desperate feminine Darius Green, with his flying machine. No wonder you stopped the horses." "Oh, I heard of a man who stopped a stampede of camels that way out west once," Barbara answered abstractedly. There was a puzzled look on her face. "Molly," she said abruptly, as they entered the house, "you didn't take our money with you when you went into the bedroom for pencil and paper?" "Why, no," replied Molly wonderingly. "It must be over there on the table now. I remember I noticed it as I came into the room. I wondered, for a second, why you'd gone away and left it so near the open window. That was before I thought the window and saw what you were doing. It must be there." And Molly hurried over to the window. The next moment she turned an astonished face to her sister. "Barbara!" she exclaimed. "It isn't here anywhere." Indeed, the marble top of the little table was absolutely bare. There was no sign of either of the gold pieces. "Look on the floor," said Barbara quietly. Both girls stopped and began a careful survey of the carpeted floor under the table and near the window. Their search was unrewarded. "Let's look in the grass outside," suggested Molly. "You might have brushed them off as you went through the window." "But didn't you say you saw them on the table when you came back into the room and found me gone?" queried Barbara thoughtfully. "I was sure I did," Molly replied, "but sometimes one remembers imaginary things, and if the money has been in the room when I came in, it would be there now. I'll ask mother." "No, don't," said Barbara quickly. "At least not yet." Mrs. Thurston had gone into the kitchen directly after her return from the gate, and had heard none of the conversation. "There's no need to worry mother about it now. Of course we must find it somewhere. Money doesn't walk off by itself. We'll go out and look in the grass under the window." On hands and knees the girls worked through the closely cropped grass underneath the sitting room window. Not 2 days before, they themselves had clipped this bit of lawn with big shears, and it was so close that there seemed no possibility of anything being hidden in it. Certainly nothing was to be found. The girls even looked over the short path and ground near it. "Your skirts might have switched those small things in a long way," observed Molly wisely. Yet as before, the result was nothing. Giving it up, at last the girls sat down in a little garden seat at one side of the tiny yard, and looked at each other ruefully. "I am so glad. I feel sure Miss Stuart will invite us to her party now," commented Molly dryly. "Our new gowns and pink hair ribbons and silk stockings will be so awfully fetching. But where, by all that's mysterious, can those double eagles have flown?" Suddenly she looked curiously at her sister. "Barbara, you are thinking of something," she exclaimed. "Have you any nameable idea?" "No," said Barbara quickly. "It isn't nameable." "All right. You never would talk when you didn't want to," complained Molly. "And I know you want that money back as badly as I do. Tell you what, I'll say the fairy's charm. Don't you remember the one the old gypsy woman taught us? Wish she were here to say it for us. She promised to do all sorts of things for me when I found her in the field with a sprained ankle and helped her back to camp. Why, Barbara, this is uncanny. She's coming now." In truth, down the road, a queer little bent figure was seen approaching. "I know her," continued Molly eagerly, "by that funny combination of red and yellow handkerchiefs she wears on her head. Do let's go and meet her and tell her. It can't do any harm." "What nonsense, Molly," laughed Barbara, but she followed her younger sister, who had already started down the road toward the quaint little gaudily turbaned dame. Between them the girls brought her into the yard, Molly meanwhile busily explaining their predicament. "You'll help us, won't you, Granny Ann?" she coaxed childishly. "You said that time that I helped you home you'd always be near when I wanted you." Granny Ann sat on the garden seat, looking gravely down at the half laughing, half serious girls huddled at her feet. "I knowed," she began in a high, cracked voice. "I knowed my little fair one," lightly touching Molly's curls, "would need me to day. Far away I was, when I heard the shadow of her voice callin' out to me, and miles I have traveled to reach her. Granny Ann is thirsty, and she has no food since morning." The old woman looked reproachfully at her listeners. Barbara's eyes twinkled at Molly's rather crestfallen face when the sibyl voiced this most human request. But she said cheerily, "All right, Granny. Supper isn't ready yet, but I know Mother'll have something." Then Barbara hurried into the house, the gypsy dame waiting solemnly until she reappeared, a moment later, with sandwiches, doughnuts, and a big glass of milk. Granny Ann smiled, but she didn't speak until the lunch had quite disappeared. Then the old woman rose impressively. "There's one sure magic for fetching back money that has gone," she declaimed. "Because you have been good to me, fair little one, you and your sister, I will say the golden spell for you." With her hands crossed, Granny Ann began to croon dreamily. "Gold is gladsome, gold is gay, here tonight and gone today, here today and gone tomorrow, guest of joy and host of sorrow, gold of mine that's flitted far, forget me not where you are. Mine you are, as Pluto wrought you, mine you are, whoever sought you. Come by sea or come by land, homeward fly into my hand." 3 times Granny Ann repeated this. Then with a queer dignity, oddly sorting with her variegated raiment, she turned to the girls. "It will return," she said. "Now I must go to my own people." "But I thought you said you came here for us by yourself," protested Molly. The gypsy dame drew herself up. "I travel not alone," she said stiffly. "Good bye." "Oh, good bye, and thanks ever so much, Granny Ann," cried both of the girls. But Granny Ann did not turn her head. Barbara looked at Molly, her eyes dancing. "The blessed old fraud," she teased. "Her people decided to camp somewhere about, and she thought she'd come over for a call and a lunch and whatever else she could get. I believe she actually expected us to cross her palm with silver for saying that little rhyme. But I wish I knew, really." All at once a faint chug chug sounded in the distance. In a moment a big red touring car appeared, enveloped in dust. "Why, it looks like Ruth's car!" exclaimed Molly excitedly. "Yes, I do believe that young man seated beside the chauffeur is Mr. Townsend, who was with them, Barbara." But Barbara was walking quickly toward the gate. A moment later the automobile stopped before it, and Harry Townsend stepped out. "Miss Thurston," he began soberly, "have you lost any money?" "Oh, yes!" burst out Molly, who was just behind before Barbara could speak. "2 $20 gold pieces. We've hunted and hunted. We had them this afternoon." "Then this must be yours," said the man, extending his hand to Barbara. In it were 2 golden double eagles. "When the young ladies were getting out of the hotel these were found on the seat, and Miss Stuart was sure you had dropped them out of your pocket, Miss Thurston, during the few moments you were in the machine. I am very glad to be able to restore them to you." "Yes," said Barbara, "but Then she stopped. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend," she said, giving him a clear, direct glance. For some unknown reason the young man's eyes wavered under it, and he climbed hurriedly into the automobile. "I am very glad," he murmured again. "Miss Stuart expects you to morrow," he added quickly, and the machine backed round and hurried off. Barbara stood looking at it, the money still in her hand. But Molly was laughing happily. Then she saw Barbara's face. "Barbara, what is it, dear?" she demanded. "You look exactly as you did before Granny Ann appeared, and I asked you if you were thinking of something. What is it? Can't you tell me?" Barbara shook her head. "It really isn't anything, Mollykins. I did have an idea in my head, but I must be mistaken somehow. You are sure you saw the money on the table after I left the room? It must have been there then, when the crowd from the automobile came in. I thought I saw some one standing near the table with one hand resting on it when I came back and called out, 'Now I've caught you.' But I must not think anything more about it. Please don't ask me any questions. Let us just be glad we have the money back. It is queer, though. Mr. Townsend says the money was found on the seat. I wonder who found it, and whether it was found on the front or back seat. Let's ask Grace. I don't understand it. But he brought the money back, and he's Miss Stuart's friend. Of course we will keep quiet, you and I, Molly, whether the money was lost, strayed, or stolen." "Well, I am sure, Barbara Thurston," Molly answered a little indignantly, "I am not likely to talk of what I know nothing about. If there is any mystery about the disappearance of that money, I am sure you have left me utterly in the dark." "Don't be cross," said Barbara, putting her arm in Molly's. "But do you know if Mr. Townsend is a special friend of Gladys's?" Molly shook her head. "How should I know?" she said. "Let's go in. It's nearly dark." End of chapter 2.